Hello everyone and welcome to episode number 173 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host, Neelan, the Orange Tank, and with me as always are my co-hosts, Mark and Kellen, the Green and Red Tanks. How are you both doing?
Doing great.
Doing swell, sir.
This week on the Board Game Barrage podcast, we are going to be talking about bad games. We spent 172 episodes talking about only the best games that the industry has to offer, so we're going to shake things up, as we like to do, and talk about bad games this week.
We're going to run out of things to flip the script on. I feel like we've been flipping the script
a
couple of times recently.
Next week, we're going to be talking about one more thing that we've just happened to never talk about, and we'll just keep doing that every single episode. That's the way to keep it fresh, Callan. But before we get there, we're going to be talking about the games that we've been playing. This week on the show, Kellen's going to be talking to us about Scape Goat, and I'm going to be telling us a little bit about Bunny Kingdom and Bullet Heart before Mark closes us out with Four Gardens. So let's get right into it. Well, almost right into it, because at this point you might have realized that none of those games are the games that we were supposed to have been talking about in celebration of our Cinco de Ocho return to board games. Unfortunately, we've had to postpone that. We had a little personal emergency come up, and we will be revisiting Cinco de Ocho at a later date. I don't know if that works. Yeah. What's 15 in Spanish?
And don't inquire about the details of the personal emergency because we can't comment on open murder investigations.
Yes.
Our lawyers have advised us against it.
Well, let's get right into it with the games we did play. Kellen, why don't you kick us off?
So Scape Goat is a game that Mark, Neil, and Christina and I had the chance to play masked up at a park, and now that social distancing is coming to an end with vaccinations, it is one of the first social deduction games that I wanted to try with a different group. Scape Goat is a newer social deduction game where it is a game of everyone at the table versus one other player. Except you don't know if you are that one player or if you're part of the group. So everyone in the group knows that the scapegoat is red, and they are all trying to pinpoint it on red. But Red thinks that the scapegoat is the purple goat player. And so you play a very small social deduction game where everyone is trying to figure out who knows what, and the scapegoat can never figure out that they are the scapegoat, because if they do, they can go to the cops and they can squeal on the group, and then they win the game. So functionally what you're doing in the game is you're actually just moving around all these little cards and collecting information. You know, you can look at another player's hand. Everyone has a number of cards in their hand based on the player count that has colored cards related to the other goats at the table. And when you get to the frame action, which is sort of the action where everyone tries to pinpoint it on the one, everyone has to reveal a colored card, and that must be the correct card of that scapegoat. So everyone at the table in a 6-player game, all 5 players must have a red card, and then they've successfully framed the scapegoat and they win the game. So what you're doing is you're going to spaces, you're taking actions, you're looking at other people's cards, you're trading one card with people, but at every location you visit, you have to pick up the public discarded card there and then discard one of your own 3 cards onto that pile. So what that means is 5 out of 6 players are trying to make sure they all have one color card, the red card, and the red player is sitting there going, why are none of my cards available? I see no red, and they start getting slowly paranoid, and then they start looking around and saying, wait a minute, am I the scapegoat? And then everyone at the table has to reassure them, no, you're not the scapegoat. You know, it's no, it couldn't be you. Because if they run to the cops, they win the game. What's interesting is that anyone can run to the cops. And if they do, the scapegoat wins the game. So even if you're not the scapegoat, you can become so paranoid that you run to the cops. And essentially that's the game. I haven't described all of the 4 or 5 actions that you can take, but it is just this weird reverse. Most social deduction games you can sort of describe like, oh, it's this part of the resistance plus this part of Codenames. And you're like, okay, I get it. With Scapegoat, there's something weird here where paranoia sets in for everyone from the very beginning of the game. And yet 9 out of 10 times or 5 out of 6 times, you're in the majority and you're just all kind of laughing, you know, and you're like, Mark, do you like your hand? Mark says, yeah, Kellen, I like my hand. And then I go to the space, and so I look at Mark's hand, and then I look at him, and I'm like, okay, we're in trust together. I had a really funny situation where the scapegoat was very suspicious, and he said, Kellen, I want to look at your hand, and I want to like what I see. And I'm like, uh-oh. I had his card, but I had two other cards, and so I was desperately hoping one of those two was the color that he thought the scapegoat was. And so he picked up my cards, he was looking at them, he looked me in the eyes, and I said, do you like what you see? Because I didn't know. And he said, no, Kellen, I don't like what I see. And he was a very scared scapegoat. Luckily, we were able to frame him before he was able to make it to the police. We played this at a 6-player count. I have now played it at the 4 and at the 6-player count. A very unique social deduction game. I will say that the art is absolutely atrocious. Is that too much?
It's functional. I wouldn't say it's like aggressively bad, right?
I would say it's in the bottom 5 board game arts I've ever seen. And I actually thought that the game was shovelware as a result of looking at it. Now, again, I don't like anthropomorphic goats. So if
Yeah, that is a
As a
strong
rule.
stand you've had, yeah.
That makes sense now why you would think that.
So maybe you're more into this. We actually received this as a review copy, and I thought it was like the game they used to protect the other game in the box that they were sending us because of how ugly it was. But pleasantly surprised. It was the best game that I played at my social game night with my younger brother and his friends. What do you guys think about Scape Goat? I know it was a few months back that we got to try this.
Yeah, I don't really remember the details super well. Although that being said, I remember the rule set being pretty easy to explain. I also remember it being surprisingly good for the 4 players that we had for a social deduction game. It's like a player combination and a type of game that you wouldn't think would work well, but I remember it being effective at 4. So yeah, I would definitely play it again based on what you just said and based on my recollection.
That's actually a really good point. Like 4-player social deduction games are not typically very good, and this one I thought worked well. My overwhelming feeling since playing it was wanting to replay it. It felt really, really unique for all the reasons you described, Kellen. And I think that one specific thing you hit on, where at the start of the game, typically in a social deduction game like something like The Resistance, you get one concrete piece of information, like I am on the good team or I am on the bad team. In Scapegoat, everyone is working with this kind of, well, I could be the bad guy. So that's sort of like group paranoia where everyone is trying to suss out what other people know, whether or not that person knows whether that information is legit, is very, very cool.
It kind of felt like it got deeply personal because it's like someone gets scared. It's that feeling of getting scared that you're the scapegoat, and then you reassure them. It's not like I'm on your team. It's like, no, don't be scared. But actually, you just are trying to get them. But one that doesn't feel like all the other social deduction games and is very clever underneath it all. That is Scapegoat.
So, Kellen, Christina, and I played Bunny Kingdom. Now, Kellen had played this
before the murder.
Yes, before the murder happened. Kellen, Christina, and I were deeply embroiled in the game of Bunny Kingdom when the screams broke out. Kellen had played this before. For Christina and I, this was our first time. This is a drafting game where the cards you're drafting are going to determine where you place bunnies onto this map, and there is a scoring phase that happens every round based on how big your little bunny kingdoms are, how many resources they're producing, and how many castles you have in that kingdom. And there are a bunch of other little scoring cards that you can collect. I really dug this. I thought it was a really light, fun drafting game. It felt like a really good introduction to drafting that I would recommend to most people that wanted to move beyond, like, say, the Sushi Go level of a very, very simple drafting game. One of the things I was saying to Kellen afterwards is it felt so close to being like, I could play this with, say, my mother. Like, it's just right on that borderline of like being family weight plus, while also just looking really, really cool. Like, as the game progresses and the board is just filling with these bunnies, it just has this escalation to it. And as the points just start increasing and increasing and increasing, I thought it was really fun. I think Christina hit on something towards the end of it, which I had thought at the time, because I was really legitimately enjoying it while we were playing it, but it's perhaps a little bit long for how light and potentially it is, which is to say that there are cards that you might flip up at the end and then you just get a ton of points that you didn't necessarily see coming, but you have to be okay with that. That's the sort of game it is, and that reveal is fun. So I'm very intrigued to like play this with the expansions you were talking about, Kellen. That could be a lot of fun.
Yeah. I think Bunny Kingdom, a lot of times I feel like we think that we're above the charm of just watching little bunny sculpts sort of go out on the board and sort of slowly expand outward and kind of seeing this disastrous, crazy map building up. But it really does have that visual pleasure. One of the things that's interesting in Bunny Kingdom is that you draft end of game victory conditions. And so I went so hard into doing that like my board presence was destroyed. And I was, I think, over 100 points behind Neelan when we started scoring end of game. But I had a fat stack of end of game scoring conditions, and we were going one by one. One by one. I'm going to get ahead of him. I did not, but it was way closer than Neelan thought it was. We got really, down to like the last 4. I was like, oh, please, God, please.
And I think what you just described is what makes that step fun, right? Like, I would have felt like I got cheated out of the win at that point, but it was a fun moment. The other game I want to talk about is Bullet Heart. So we did actually already speak about this when Kellen and I played the tabletop simulator version of this. But I thought it was worth revisiting in the actual play because it is a very physical sort of game. It's not necessarily a dexterity game, but it is a real-time game where you are placing chits onto your board in order to create patterns that you can then clear. So think of this as one of those sort of puzzle match video games where you have circles of different colors coming in from the top of the screen and you're trying to line them up in specific ways in order to clear them out. This is replicating that. As you're bringing in these sort of chits, placing them onto your board, you're playing cards to match patterns in order to clear a bunch of these bullets, they're called, and send them to your neighboring player, which is one of the things that becomes that much more fun in real life, is watching someone at the end of their turn of just being, head down, focusing on the board, looking up and seeing this like fat stack of bullets that have come from the player to their right. There were a couple of moments where people would just be like, wait, how did you get this many? And like that moment of just being surprised by how well the player next to you had done, that was a lot of fun in real life.
The two things that I will say is that, one, this occurred after the murder, so take that for what you will in terms of how it affected our mood. And two, I think that when a Kickstarter comes out, a lot of the joy and fun is up until that moment where you actually play it. You get really, really excited. It's shipping. It's almost here. It's here. I'm reading the rules. And then you play it and you're like, oh. And what I will say about Bullet Heart is that, Neelan and I frequently will say, okay, you back this or I'll back this. And as soon as we got done playing the game, I was upset that Neelan had won this one and had backed Bullet Heart. And so I have been casually browsing for how to get a copy of it. It's a very delightful little game. Very, very fun.
And super fast as well. I think even though it was the three of us playing, because all of the players simultaneous, I don't think it would be that different with any number of players. And it's about 15 to 20 minutes before like all the players are eliminated and you get down to just the winner. It's just really slick and fast in that way. And it did also seem like the characters had a lot of variety in them. Your character, Kellen, was doing something with like sliding bullets around the board in order to push them off the edge, which is pretty different from how the rest of the players typically clear their board. So there seemed like there was a fair bit of variability just in the different character options. Very happy with Bullet Heart. Glad to have it in my collection. Sorry, Kellen. And that is Bullet Heart. Mark, what have you been playing?
I've been playing Four Gardens. This is the newest release by Arcane Wonders. It is a very straightforward resource gathering recipe fulfillment game. On your turn, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking 3 actions. You're going to have a hand of 5 cards, and you're going to be taking 3 actions, each action requiring the use of a card. The actions really boil down to 3 things. 1, you can place down a piece of a panorama. Each piece will have a couple of resources that you need to fulfill it. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to complete these panoramas of varying sizes. So there is a 2-card size panorama all the way to like a large 5-card size panorama. So that's one thing. Place down a piece of a panorama in order to fulfill the recipe to complete it. Second thing you can do is gather resources. And this is the big sort of novelty aspect of the game. The way you gather resources is there is a big pagoda that is in the center of the table. It is this 4-story pagoda, maybe like a foot tall sort of thing, that is in the middle of the table, and it's got 4 levels on it. Each level corresponds to a different resource. So there are 4 resources. Each level of the pagoda corresponds to a resource. And each side of the pagoda may have 1 of a resource, 2 of a resource, 3 of a resource, or none of a resource. So, for example, the bottom floor may be stone, and it may be blank. It may be 1 stone, 2 stone, or 3 stone. So when you're gathering resources, what you're doing is you're playing a card, and the card will depict the pagoda. It will depict a floor of the pagoda, and it will depict a direction on the pagoda. So, for example, if you play a card that highlights the second story of the pagoda, what you do is you have to rotate that second story to the left or right, 90 degrees, and then, depending on the direction that is depicted on the card, you must gather resources in that direction. So, for example, I play a card, it depicts the second story of the pagoda, and the arrow is going from down to up. So I would rotate that second story, either to get more of a certain resource or less of a certain resource, and then I would start getting the resources from bottom up. When we were first being taught this game and sort of trying to figure out the rules of it, we were wondering, like, why wouldn't you just always turn the pagoda to the side that has the most resources? Well, the reason you don't do that is you only have a capacity of 4 resources at any one time, and you must take the resources in the direction that it depicts. So, for example, if I want water, and water is on the 3rd floor, and the card I play is pointing upwards from the bottom, I must take what's on the bottom floor. I must take what's on the 2nd floor to get to the water on the 3rd floor. And if I only have 4 resource spots available, that means I'm probably going to actually adjust the pagoda to have those first 2 floors blank on my side. So there's that sort of interesting trying to decide how you want to manipulate the pagoda. Also, whenever you get resources, you must manipulate the pagoda. So the resource distribution that you're looking at any one time will never be the distribution that you are going to be picking up from. So you have to keep that in mind. And then finally, the last thing that you can do of the 3 things is to use the resources that you've gathered and place them on the cards to complete the recipes, to flip these cards to their painted side in order to try to get these panoramas done. There's this interesting race aspect. So there are bonus tiles you can get that sort of like give you powers, and you get these bonus tiles whenever you complete a panorama. So that will lead you to wanting to complete the smaller panoramas because you finish that 2-panel panorama really quickly, and then you get a bonus. However, and this is the final interesting part of this game, each piece of the panorama has a color, 1 of 4 colors. And whenever you complete a piece of the panorama, you move up on the corresponding scoring track. So say I complete my first part of a panorama, it's purple, I move up the purple track, scoring more points in purple at the end of the game. And that scoring track is where all the points are gathered. That's the only source of points. And then when you score the second card of any one panorama, you score all the colors again. So if my first card was a purple, and then my second card in that panorama was a red, I would score on the second card red and then purple again. So that's what makes the bigger panoramas more valuable, because on that 5-card panorama, when you finish that 5th card, you're doing that entire set of colors again. And one last bit that I found sort of a nice little twist that was interesting is whenever you get the end of a track of any certain color and you need to keep going, instead of going further, you bump your opponents back on the track. So if I'm at the very end of purple and I need to move up again, instead of moving up, I move my opponents back. And if you ever knock them off of the track, they cannot score that color. So that's a nice little sort of edge to an otherwise sort of like gentle game. The game is like a not super interactive resource gathering, resource manipulation, recipe fulfillment game, but that consideration to how to do scoring does give it a nice little sharp edge that I enjoyed. Overall, I liked the game. The table presence is great. It does feel like the pagoda is sort of making an otherwise sort of simple way to distribute resources like a little more flashy than it needs to be, but the pagoda is a big sort of nice part to it, and manipulating the pagoda is fun, and the game itself is only about 45 minutes. I think if it was an hour and a half, it would start to be annoying, the twisting around and the figuring out and even having this thing. But for a 45-minute, simple to teach, quick to play game, it's good. It's a solid Euro with a couple nice bits and a little bit of an edge there to the scoring.
So as you were describing the pagoda system, I'm imagining it maybe a little bit more puzzly than it sounds like you're describing. So you're saying it doesn't feel like quite as interesting a consideration as to how you're manipulating it?
It is a puzzle, but it just feels like the 3D-ification of something that could be done in a simpler way with cards.
I see what you're saying.
Or something like that, yeah.
Like the mechanic of the gimmick itself is not necessarily as simple as it could be if it had been done some other way.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, but the glitz, I think, makes up for it.
Okay, yeah.
And it is functional. It does allow you to visualize the way to manipulate the different resources in a clear fashion.
Cool.
So that is Four Gardens by Arcane Wonders.
So before we get to our feature topic, I wanted to plug our new Board Game Barrage wiki. So we launched this last week, and it's already starting to kick off with people coming up with cool pages on it. One of the ones that was added today that I thought was pretty cool is Mad Rex in our Discord has been documenting the tournaments that we've been playing in Board Game Arena, which is great. So you can see every tournament that has happened so far. You can see the winners, second place, third place. And in case you weren't aware, you can sign up for these board game tournaments. They're entirely run by people in the community in the digital tabletop channel in our boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Let's get into the feature topic. We are talking about bad games. Specifically, why we wanted to talk about this and why we thought this was a potentially interesting topic is this idea that a game being bad is obviously somewhat of a subjective opinion. And we wanted to sort of navigate where that opinion crosses over into your willingness to play a game despite it being quote unquote bad. So an example of this might be a game that despite you knowing that it's bad, that despite it being a game that you would never sort of bring up or has very clear design or mechanical flaws, you'd still say, you know what, I'll play that game anyway, depending on the circumstances. So I think that's a good place to kick off this discussion, guys. What are the circumstances that make a bad game worth playing? If you believe that at all, are bad games worth playing in the first place?
It's tough. I think that if you go into it and you know it's a bad game and it's long, I think that is I would say the overriding for me consideration as to whether or not I would consider playing a bad game. A long bad game strikes me as something that is too grueling to deal with. But there are reasons that you would want to play bad games. I think for me, one of them is if they do something that I know I like. So for example, a type of bad game that I will often be interested in is a trivia game. There's a lot that is wrong with trivia games. You know, Wits and Wagers sort of fixes the obvious thing where if you don't know the answer, you just are going to lose the game. But I am a sucker generally for trivia games. If somebody broke out Trivial Pursuit, I might even be interested in running that, although that one is a long one. But in general, trivia games are a type of bad game that I'm into.
I think that's actually a really good example and one that actually is pretty true for me as well. Like, I've played plenty of bad trivia games. But again, because I have that same sort of kick for trivia, I will definitely suffer through it. I've not played Trivial Pursuit in a long time, but yeah, I would agree with that. Like, if for whatever reason the situation came up where someone was like, man, we're playing Trivial Pursuit tonight, I would do that.
Yeah.
I think that my POV on this can be summed up in one of my favorite quotes and one of Christina's least favorite quotes to hear me say over and over again. And the translation that I read in high school was, "You must needs have wished to die to know how good it feels to live." The Goodreads translation here is saying it's necessary to have wished for death in order to know how good it is to live. And that is from The Count of Monte Cristo. And I do think I could rest my case right here. But in reality, I have this thing where in movie land, a lot of times I get into a rote place where I am watching the latest sci-fi film that I know I will like, or the latest A24 release, which is a studio or production company that I know they make quality movies. But I've been trying harder in more recent months to every once in a while take a flyer on something that I think is going to be bad or that like is going to do something pretty weird or wild that like is probably not going to work out. And I've started to have that thought a little bit about board games, that one of the results of not having like a friendly local game night is that a lot of the games that you are playing, you're self-selecting for harder and harsher and more literally. So the sort of like pedestrian Euro games that come out all the time that are not bad games, but are bad games for Kellen, I just don't have exposure to because I don't buy them and you two don't bring them to my house. And yet, you know, once every 3 months, there is something perhaps important about being a part of the board game hobby to try one of them to see if there's something new that has happened in the last few years since you've looked at that, but also to just like anchor your own tastes against what's happening. And then in reality, to know how good you have it with your highly interactive, really fun board games.
What I like about that is that it dovetails pretty nicely with something that a lot of people describe about this idea that of what's called like the 7 out of 10 problem, where people will typically just rank a lot of games that they've played in this sort of upper bracket. It's very common in video game discussion. But the reality is exactly the same thing you're describing, Kellen, is that you're typically not exposed to the games that fall in the bottom half of that bracket, right? Because of this self-selection process, because you're already going through a curation process when you buy a game. It's a game that you've been exposed to through another reviewer, through another critic. So it's just very rare that you will get the opportunity to play a truly bad game. And I do think it's necessary sometimes just to calibrate your like overall perspective. Not necessarily that you should seek out to do it, but it's hard to get a really good sense for like the scope of quality of games until you've experienced the really, really bad.
Do either of you guys actually, on any level, seek out these like sort of bad games to recalibrate?
No. And I'm not even trying to imply that you should actively do this. But I think the best example for us, I think, is when we go to like a convention, right? And we're demoing a lot of games. Like that is a scenario where we're sort of somewhat, just through lack of knowledge or because we haven't had that curation process, we're just trying a lot of games. And we don't know whether they're going to be hits or misses. But I always find that a valuable experience just to see the sorts of games that we wouldn't ordinarily be playing, you know?
Right.
And I mean, I think that there's a difference between casual participation in the hobby. You know, I have 2 nights a month where I can play board games, and someone who is stupid enough to take that next step and make a board game podcast, where you're part of the conversation. You want to be playing the games that are coming out in that 3-month span. And there is that range of bad to good. And I do think there's value in looking at what isn't working or what doesn't work. And I think that there are certain games that you just start playing and you just know within 2 turns that you're like, oh, this game just doesn't work. You know, this designer was not participating in the board game hobby.
Right.
So sort of the corollary to that question is, where is the line? How do you judge that line we're talking about? Where, like, if a game is seemingly or obviously too bad to be worth playing? Or what are the sort of games that you've played where you'd be like, you know what, there was nothing of value in this. I regret having played this. No one should play this. Because I feel like one of the things that we can always often see about, you know, some bad games is, well, it's not for me, or it's not for us, it's not for Board Game Barrage, but I can kind of see who this is for. But are there games or are there types of games that don't even meet that threshold?
I would say that I have a much higher tolerance than, say, Kellen does for like a trading in the Mediterranean themed game. Would you agree with that, Kellen? When it comes to trading in the Mediterranean theme, resource manipulation, you're generally not so hot on those.
Confirmed.
Or would you disagree with that? Okay.
Oh, no, I was thinking about it.
And I think a lot of people are sort of there, especially in the modern, most cutting edge of the hobby. I think there's been a move away from, you know, the dour guy on the cover and, you know, the trading in the Mediterranean setting. I generally have a higher tolerance for that type of game. But I will say that if you are telling me about a game and it is a trading in the Mediterranean game that lasts 90 minutes and it's resource gathering and conversion or gathering resources to sell them, I'm close to being checked out already. You've got to give me like a hook or something, because if that's what you're basing it on, that's going to be a very, very high bar to sort of hit to make me even interested in playing it.
I think that, Mark, is an interesting point that I was trying to figure out how to articulate, which is that the more board games you play, the more often that you see that other board games are just like an amalgamation of mechanisms from other board games. So it's not that they are bad. It's just that they are not as good as the 17 other versions of that you've already played.
Right.
A small little anecdote, you know, I had a chance to play Spicy this past weekend and Liar's Dice. And the best way to describe Spicy is that it's cockroach poker and Liar's Dice in a card game format. And it's got these beautiful cards. It's a fine game, but it's also mechanically more complicated than Liar's Dice. It's got variants added to it to try to make it more interesting than Liar's Dice. It's got shiny cards to try to make you realize that it's better than Liar's Dice, but it's just not better than Liar's Dice or Cockroach Poker. And so that my familiarity with those other games makes Spicy bad, in quotes, though to be clear, it's not bad and I like the game, but that your familiarity breeds that level of going like, this is less good than that.
One of the sort of examples of like a category or genre of game. I don't know if I'd hesitate to call it either of those really, but it's the sort of game that sort of arose in the wake of something like Cards Against Humanity or Apples to Apples, where there are these comedy games where the real appeal seems to be read the clever or funny things that the author wrote on these cards. And the game part of that component is so severely diminished, where the intent seems to be like, oh, look at the somewhat funny things that we can do as a result of these cards that have been pre-written. And those always strike me as straight up just bad games that, especially when they start to devolve into the level of offensive that, say, Cards Against Humanity hits, it just strikes me as something I just kind of don't want to touch. Just because I know I'm not going to have a good time playing it. I generally don't feel like they make for as good games as sometimes just straight up reading the cards. And it does seem like there was like a whole, almost like a subgenre of these games that sort of took up in the wake. These sort of like, quote unquote, adult party games.
Oh yeah, I think they're still being...
Totally. Yeah, no, I'm sure that they're still incredibly popular.
That being said, I think that a type of quote unquote bad game, with maybe the stress on the game, that I do like is maybe just a step beyond those for me, which is the interactive party game. And what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about that is like True Colors and Intervention, and these games where it does get, to reuse a term we've used earlier, spicy, but it's like where the players are sort of forced to interact with each other in ways that can be uncomfortable. Another example is Scruples. I like those games that there's not much game there, but it forces these like uncomfortable or interesting or moments that you otherwise would not confront in a way that I always find sort of interesting and fun.
I feel like the key difference there, and I agree with you, is that even though these are games are also like in the quote unquote adult party game genre, the big difference between something like a Scruples and something like a Cards Against Humanity is with Scruples, the intent is you're bringing a lot of yourself to the game, right? Like you're revealing something about yourself. The game hinges upon the interesting discussions that players are bringing to the game.
Right.
That feels like a different sort of beast in a way that I would agree, like separates it out from that genre a fair bit. Something I wanted to come back to about the context of like when a game is specifically enjoyed by someone you know or a group you know. And this is not necessarily something I would pick, but I will play this because you all like it. Like I do think there is something to that, which I think moves us pretty cleanly into the next question I had, which is, what are some games that you'll acknowledge are bad games, but given the right circumstances, you've played and enjoyed and will play and may continue to play? And I guess just to finish up that thought, one of the examples I think came to me for this was Betrayal at House on the Hill, which is a game that I think was in some ways an interesting early game to play as I was joining the hobby, because, you know, in the way that I've described Resistance as, oh, I didn't realize games could have this sort of dynamicism to them. Like, Betrayal House on the Hill struck me as that as well early on. But I think the thing is, one of the things you realize as you play it, and especially as you start to compare it to other games, is it's 75% of ambling around this board, doing pretty much nothing in order to sort of seed like the random number generator, which determines the last 25% of the game, which is probably going to be broken and balanced, and depending on all the previous setup, just maybe entirely busted and like finish in a turn completely unsatisfyingly. Like there's so much that is just broken and badly designed about that game. And yet, it's actually one of my friends' favorite games, if not their favorite. So I always love to, when they say, like, hey, this is a game that I want to play, I want to like get a couple of people around and play this, I'll always be okay to be a part of that, because I love and appreciate the fact that I want to see what they see in the game. You know, I want to see what a group will be getting out of this, even if it just means I'm sort of somewhat quietly keeping my thoughts to myself and just sort of partaking in the experience. I feel like that's a context where I will play a game that I don't like.
Betrayal is interesting to me because I do feel sort of the same way about it. What gets me about Betrayal is I'm always convinced that that whole thing where, you know, one person, it becomes a one against all twist, the haunt or whatever you call it. It's such a like interesting idea, and I know it often breaks down in the execution, but it's such an interesting concept that I always am interested to play it, or I'm willing to play it because I'm just thinking like, well, what if this time it really does hit? That'll be a fun twist or a fun like experience in board gaming that I otherwise wouldn't get.
And I think you're right, because I think that is the only part of Betrayal that I do like is just that moment of like, oh, what's it gonna be? You know, like that kind of like you're setting up and you're reading the rules. But I will say, like Mark, I've now played more games of Betrayal than I would care to. It's never gone great in the haunt. I've never had a satisfying haunt. It just hasn't happened.
I think that there is this type of game that it sort of has like one central gimmick, and that gimmick is funny or fun, and so you want to show it to people, but it's like not a good game. And so I recently played an Oink game for the second time. This game is called Money Bags, and the premise of the game is essentially like you divvy up loot into these 6 bags with 6 players, and then when you hold the bag, you can't hold the bottom of your bag to figure out how much money you have. You can only hold the top of your bag. And so you're just shaking and jangling the coins around, and then someone will loot from you. And so they steal your money, they take your bag, and then they have to divide the loot between your 2 bags. And that's when they can hold the bottom of the bag. And then they hand it back to you, and you have to accuse them of not distributing it evenly between the 2 of you. So all you can do is shake your bag and look at the other bag that the other player has, shake your bag, and then go like, BS, or you stole from me, and like, that's the game. And so the context of like handing out these bags and like these really nice coins, and then there's 1 diamond, which is like a little variable that counts for 10 coins, but it's really light. And like everyone is really jazzed about the idea of money bags. So much so that I was jazzed about teaching money bags to this group of people. But like, the game just doesn't work. You literally are just shaking your bag. It's pretty random. You can get screwed early and often. You're out of the round. You have to play 3 rounds to even make it somewhat balanced. It's obnoxious. And yet, am I going to get rid of money bags? I don't know. Because, like, if you haven't played it, like, Mark, you haven't played this, right?
Right.
And I said that, and in your mind you thought...
It sounds like fun. It does definitely sound like fun. Like, I could see us shaking these bags and arguing over people stealing from our bags, and you're giving this back to me light, and yeah, I could see it for sure.
Yep.
Speaking of games with central gimmicks, I think another type of quote-unquote bad game that I do enjoy are games that have a central gimmick, and often it's one that is like has to do with like dexterity. I'm thinking of a couple games. Pucket is a game that I've always enjoyed. This is, I think, quite an old game where both players are sitting across from each other with this board, and they have sort of like rubber bands on their side, and they're trying to flick a puck into a small opening between them, and you're trying to get all the pucks on one person's side, and if you get all the pucks on your opponent's side, you win the game. Callan and I had a unfortunately epic game of this where I think I had a strong lead, and then Callan came back and sent all the pucks over to my side, and I ended up with the L.
Your defeat in that game, you can hear it in the video that was recorded.
Yeah,
I think
that's soul crushing.
Is that video still on Patreon? It might still be. If you've not seen it, it is worth checking out.
It was sad moment. Another game like this is Connect 4 Launchers. This is a version of Connect 4, which is already a fantastic game, as I'm sure we all agree. But the way that you actually get the pieces on the board is you're flicking them, sort of if you ever play the game Coconuts. It's this like thing that just like launches your circles onto a 3-level board. So you can try to win Connect 4 on the top level, on the middle level, or on the bottom level. And I just love it. I always have a great time with it, even though it's like it's almost like a random game because it's so hard to adjust your shots in it. But I've always enjoyed it.
All right, Mark, and the last one that you're going to bring up, because I knew you were going to, was the game where you just drop stupid down the tower and then you listen to where it fell.
Oh, Mord and Arosa, but that's not a bad game. That is that is a legit good game. This is the game where the mechanism is listening. You drop cubes in a tower and you are trying to sort of listen to where they stop along the tower and predict where they are. And it's a fantastic game. It does not qualify for this list because it is a good game.
I think that my example that I bring up occasionally is a game called Magical Athlete. Magical Athlete is intentionally obnoxious, which if you know me means, well, I'm into the game. In Magical Athlete, it is roll to move. It is a roll to move race game, which, you know, on the face of it is absurd because I roll a 4, Mark rolls a 6. He has won the race game, except that you're drafting a hand of magical athletes and then you're doing a series of races. So you draft the athletes and they have special powers like, you know, before you roll, switch places with anyone you want to or drag someone back towards you. It's so dumb, and yet I will probably never get rid of it. And actually, it's hard to know if this qualifies for the list, because it definitely does. It's a bad game. It's a roll-to-move game. It has the worst graphic design. If you thought Scape Goat was bad, wait until you see this MS Paint. But yeah, we were talking on the Discord this past week about bad mechanisms, as a result of last week's discussion. And roll to move is kind of one of the universal ones that people can sort of agree on. Like, this is not a good mechanism. And Magical Athlete revels in it.
Similar to what Mark was saying about trivia games and bad trivia games, the genre of game that, despite how bad the game is, I will always play is any social deduction game. I sort of have this intense need to play every social deduction game that comes out, regardless of how much I know about it. And a lot of them are bad. There is a game I remember picking up early in the hobby, which is called Panic Station, which was kind of like a preemptive take on The Thing. It is very much just The Thing in everything but name, where you're moving around a map and someone is infected and that person is trying to infect all the other players. It doesn't work. I think there was actually literally a busted bad mechanic in it, but I kept trying to play it. I kept trying to get other people to play it with me, even though no one wanted to play it with me, just because I liked the idea and the social deduction element and the hidden traitor thing so much. There are a couple of other social deduction games that fall into this camp for me. Spyfall, I've mentioned, is a game that I wouldn't necessarily say is a bad game, but a game that I have this intense hatred of, but still, if it was a group firing up Spyfall, I would do it. Stuff like Mascarade, I think, is legitimately bad, but again, I can't help but be drawn into the appeal of just that hidden information genre. That's my vice. And I think that is gonna do it for our discussion on bad games. But before we go, Mark, do we have a returning feature?
You know what I love about that transition, Neil?
Yeah.
The way you started with the word but, because this is the return of Bunker, Battlefield, or Blown Away. People have been clamoring for this, and here it is, returning once again. So, I'm sure everybody knows, but for those who may not, the conceit of this segment is that we are going to look back at games we played a year ago. We talked about on the show exactly 1 year ago, and say whether or not they are in the bunker, which means, obviously, that we have kept them. They are on the battlefield, which means we have them, but they might be leaving our collection soon, or if they've been blown away and are long gone. Couldn't be more clear, couldn't be more simple. So let's go over them. I have the games here. I don't know who talked about which, but we'll see. The Crew Quest for Planet 9. This was the show with, actually, the newly crowned Best Podcast of the Year. Mike Walker was on this episode a year ago. So one of these games was talked about by Mr. Walker, so keep that in mind. But I will say that I don't know if I talked about it on the show, but I do have The Crew, and it's a game that is definitely in my bunker for sure. I'm going to definitely keeping it and don't have much plans on moving it on. Do either of you guys have this game?
I bought The Crew and played it with a couple of people who really like trick-taking games. And to be fair, I was playing it at 3-player, which I think a lot of people would say is not the ideal playing count for The Crew. But I was playing it with all the modifications that make it better at 3-player. It just really didn't hit. And I've got to be honest, like, the more I played it, the more I returned to The Crew, the less I was really digging it. So I think this is a blown away for me, which is to say that it's literally left my collection.
Wow, controversial.
I have a copy and keep looking for the perfect group to play it with, and still haven't found that, so it will stick around until I find my true friends.
Well, that's not a classification, though.
Bunker.
All right, there you go. Nice. Okay. Solo? Anybody remember talking about Solo?
Yeah, Solo is a game I played on BGA, which is like Uno, but worse. It's literal garbage. Actually, we should have brought it up in the episode. I was blown away by how bad this was.
Perfect. Okay, Renegade?
Renegade, this was a solo game that I played where you're kind of like in the mainframe in the virtual world trying to like fix a computer by hacking it from within. It was a very cool concept.
Sounds like a Nealon game.
Yeah, I mean, it very much is. It had all this like netrunnery jargon in it. This is unfortunately a game that I remember I actually borrowed from a friend. So it's a game I actually do want to seek out. So I'm going to say that that's a bunker game. I don't happen to have that copy anymore, but I would want to get my own of it. So yeah, in the bunker.
I'm pretty sure this is a way out of print game.
Well, that is going to make it really hard then.
And finally, Horrified, which I'm pretty sure I'm the person who spoke about that. I enjoyed my play of Horrified. I'm not one for co-op games. I think if I was going to play a co-op game, it might be one I'd play, but it is one that I'm pretty sure I've already traded, so it has been blown away.
A lot of lasting love for that, though.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have it on their top X list of all time. So yeah, it was good. I definitely thought it was a good game, but just co-ops are tough for me to really enjoy.
That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. As a reminder, you can check out our new wiki at boardgamebarrage.com/wiki, or just come talk and hang out with us. We're playing digital games all the time on Board Game Arena. That is at our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Otherwise, you can seek us out on all of our social media. We're on Facebook at boardgamebarrage.com/Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. Thank you for listening. And thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music, What's on Your Mind, Kid? Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Good night. I'm very tired, in case you guys can't tell. I've lost the plot in my own brain.